Greetings, men, and welcome back to the Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we get together in this community. We're not afraid to be what we are, strong, dominant alpha males in control. We don't apologize for it. Today's topic is going to be about knives, what I would consider a pretty manly topic. Now, the last few Alpha Male podcasts, if you listen to these, most of them, it's kind of more a deep theological thing, and I'm not going to quit doing that. I think that's great. But, every once in a while, mix it up, talk about something a little bit more lighthearted. So today we're going to talk about something I think most guys, if not all men, are into, which is knives. Before we roll into the bio, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment if you want to help support this podcast and this community that you're a part of. With that, guys, today's bio, I don't know how long it's going to take because I'm just going to do it off the cuff. I'm not going to use the pre-recorded one that I usually do. So if you usually skip them, if you care, you might want to listen to this one. Maybe I'll mention some stuff that I don't normally, or maybe I'll leave some stuff out that I normally mention. Like I said, I'm just going to speak off the cuff here about background. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I don't apologize for that. God is first and foremost in my life and everything that I do, and it should take preeminence and come out in everything and manifest itself in everything. This podcast is no different. You don't have to be a Christian to listen, but just know that I am, and I don't apologize for it, and I don't hide it. Grew up in the small town backwoods of the South. Grew up hunting and fishing and shooting from a very early age. Grew up shooting at a very early age and having knives from a very early age. Now, speaking of that, I just kind of had a memory come back. I remember my grandma buying me my first knife, and it was a little, clip point traditional folding knife. In fact, I still have it. It's a brass handle, and I don't know how old I was, but that's a very early memory, and I remember where it was, and I remember when I lived in that location, so I was a very, very young boy at that point. Still have that knife, the very first one that I ever had. Anyway, I did a lot of hunting and fishing growing up. Did a lot of competition shooting growing up. I joined the Marine Corps at 17. I did a couple of combat tours in Iraq in the infantry as an assaultman. After my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps, teaching urban warfare and desert warfare, small arms training, tactics. After my Marine Corps time, I went to work for LAPD, where I worked patrol assignments and more specialized assignments. Served as a firearms instructor and teacher in law enforcement. I'm an FBI certified firearms instructor, NRA certified, some other three-letter government agency certified firearms instructor and tactics instructor, advanced weapons instructor. Also served in the United States Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Served in various leadership roles, training new soldiers. Also in the Marine Corps, I was a team leader, section leader. I've also been a private contractor for the federal government. We won't really say what agency or anything about that. But I was also an instructor, tactics, firearms. As it pertains to today's topic, I also have some knife fighting training in the military, in law enforcement, and then some other training and teaching. I continued my competition shooting well into my adulthood after I got out of the military. I'm very blessed to be a state champion and even a little higher. You have regional champion. And pistol, I've also won championships in rifle. I've competed in, all kinds of other disciplines, all the way down to, hatchet throwing, knife throwing, black powder, archery. I've also been a professional hunter and guide. I've been very blessed to be able to do that. Not many people today can say they've been blessed to be a professional big game hunter, hunting things like buffalo and exotic game. But I have been very blessed to be able to do that in life and be a professional guide. I've also been the commander of a tactical team in a fairly large metropolitan area, where our main job is to stop active shooters. I am currently blessed to be a team leader of a tactical team in a fairly large metropolitan area. So that's all I'm going to say about that. It's not affiliated with the podcast. Like I said, the most alpha male thing about me is that I follow the ultimate alpha male, Jesus Christ. A follower and a servant and a simple man called by God to preach and share the good news of Jesus Christ. With that, guys, let's roll into today's topic. Like I said, something I think all, if not all, then the vast majority of men are into, which is knives. I think there's something innately manly about knives. So before we get into specific knives and whatnot. Let's talk about the why. Why, as a man, you should carry a knife? Well, as I said, first and foremost, I'm a Christian. Jesus told his disciples to be armed, to carry a sword. Now, you may not learn that in Sunday school or whatever church you attend. I hope that you do. But it certainly is biblical, and Jesus certainly told his disciples to carry a sword. You'll find that recorded in the Gospel of Luke. But now, he that has a purse, let him take it, and likewise a scrip. And he that has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. More important even than your garment, a sword. Jesus' disciples were men, and he told those men to get a sword. No, I'm not saying that if you don't carry a knife, you're not a man. I'm not saying that at all. Jesus' disciples, after he said that, in fact, told them that some of them already had swords. He said, we already have 2 swords. And he said, it is enough. I'm not saying you have to carry a sword, but I'm saying Jesus certainly told his disciples to have swords. And you could argue today whether nobody really walks around with a sword on their hip, unless it's for ceremonial purposes. But you could argue today whether the sword is a knife in your pocket or a gun. I would submit, why not both? Both are arms. But protection is only one part of why I think most men should carry a knife. Some manly qualities of an alpha male are to protect, which we just talked about, to defend, and to provide, and to shepherd. Being a provider also. As you heard in my bio, I've done quite a bit of hunting, hunted all over this beautiful country. And I may take the animal with a gun, with a firearm, but I butcher it with a knife. I turn it into food, into sustenance, into consumable portions. By God's grace, with a knife. That's the tool. And the knife has been the tool of men. Long before iPhones were a thing, long before automobiles were a thing, long before firearms were a thing, men have used knives for defense, for providing for themselves and for those around them. Now, we talked about in the bio things that I had done in the past, and I consider myself to be blessed to be an expert in many things with the blessings that I've had and experience in life. I don't consider myself to be a knife expert. There are many, many people out there that know more about knives, know more. I'm not a metallurgist. I don't know the exact difference between this kind of steel and that kind of steel. I'm not a master bushcrafter. I've never made a log cabin with a knife. You heard about my bio in the military, but I've never pretended to be some special forces clandestine guy that sneaks behind enemy lines and slits people's throats with a knife. That's I don't consider myself to be the ultimate expert on knives. But I do have some background in knives that I would like to share with you guys. Knives serve very many roles, some very specialized roles. You've got your straight up combat knives. You have a chef knife or a paring knife. But I think the bulk of this podcast and what we'll get into, most importantly for most men, is their everyday carry knife. As I said, I think most men should carry a knife on them. I don't know why an alpha male wouldn't unless there's some legal reason. And with that, with the legal caveat, you'd be surprised how convoluted some knife laws are in some states. Some places have some really weird restrictions about length of knives, about how you can carry a knife, about whether it, has to be a certain style of knife or whether certain styles are prohibited. So please check the laws in your area. Any knife that I recommend or anything that I say is with a caveat that it's legal and prudent in your area for you. So if you hadn't been carrying a knife up to this point, as that alpha male, I encourage you to consider it. And especially for everyday carry, as part of your outfit, as part of the things that you carry on you, like your wallet or your iPhone or smartphone or whatever other things you carry on you, so that you have the ability to provide and protect and to have abilities that the knife lets you exercise that you wouldn't have without it. The ability to use greater force and project greater force and violence if needed, if prudent, if necessary. We have a bad thing in culture today that, using force and violence is a bad thing, but it is not a bad thing in and of itself. It is not malum in se. It is not evil in and of itself. If somebody breaks into your house and tries to harm your wife, you want to be violent. You want to use force. If somebody's trapped in a burning car, you want to be able to use force and use that knife to get them out of that situation. Do it in the right way for the right reasons, in the ways that are lawful and outlined by God. So, with that being said, let's talk about everyday carry knives. Now, I think for your everyday carry knife, it should be something that's easy to carry, and that comes in both size and weight. But it also needs to be big enough to be useful. Big enough to be useful for common tasks. Strong enough for hard use. And if needed, be able to be used in defense. Now, I think for the majority of people, the recommendation that I'm going to give you, I give you because I have it and I use it. It's the knife that's in my pocket right now. It is the knife that's on me most of the time for my everyday carry knife. It's with me when I'm working out. Most of the time it's with me when I go running. It's with me when I'm doing my job as the leader of a tactical team. I used it when I was a professional hunter and guide. And that knife is going to be the Buck 110. The Buck 110 Slim to be specific. The old style, the Buck 110 is an American classic. An American classic like a 1911. It's been around a long time. And the 110 Slim is a little bit lighter, obviously slim, easy to carry. It is a very useful size knife. It is a great knife. Not a bad choice for butchering, skinning a deer. Is the ultimate personal defense weapon? No. I carry a gun. That's part of my EDC. I carry a firearm. I carry a .357 Smith & Wesson revolver, or I carry a Glock 26, or I carry something even bigger if I can get away with it, carrying my 1911, carrying my 2011. It's not the ultimate defensive tool. It's not the ultimate defensive knife. But it certainly is a tool that could be used for defense. It's just a good all-around solid knife. And if you're looking for a good solid EDC knife, a good solid knife you can carry, assuming it's legal, it's a knife that's a good size. It's got good utility. It's a good utilitarian knife. It's got good steel. It's got a solid locking system. It's just a good solid knife. It comes in, like I said, the Buck 110 is a classic. The Buck 110 Slim, I think, is a better EDC knife. Unless you're going to carry it on your belt, like in a belt pouch, which if you want to do that, that's great. But most people are probably going to carry it in their pocket. That's where I carry it. Now, it comes in a couple of different colors, and it comes in a couple of different grades. Just the regular Buck 110 Slim comes in at generally under $30, and it is a great knife. It also comes in a more premium version. I would advise you to get the cheaper one first and see that you like it and you use it. You may decide for whatever reason. I don't pretend to think that I know everything and that everybody should be like me. I'm not that vain. That knife might not work for you for a certain reason. You may want something different or something better, something more specialized or something bigger or something smaller. But I would say start with the Buck 110, just a base model. It's like under $30. And if you really like it and you want something a little bit more premium, step up to the versions that have a little bit better steel, S30V. Micarta handles. I have one of those also. I have one of the base models and one of the S30V models, which comes in at like somewhere around $80, $90 in that ballpark. But it is a great knife. And even the base model, it's got good steel. It stays sharp. It sharpens well. It's got a good solid lock on it. It's not wobbly. I'm not worried about it. No breaking or snapping or anything like that. For $30, it's a heck of a good knife. Is it the only game in town? No. There's a lot of other good knives that are in that same ballpark. I think would be fine EDC knives. I've carried, and I carried for years, even in the military, little folding pocket knives. Gerber. They make some really budget-friendly knives, and they make some really high-end knives, and I've had both. And, just going to Walmart and getting yourself a good locking Gerber or Kershaw or one of those other brands, a good locking knife. But, something that's not too big to be ridiculous and that you're not going to leave at home, and something big enough to be useful in the 2.5 to 3.5 to 4-inch range. A good folding knife. My one caveat, I'll say, make sure that it's a locking knife. I learned the hard way. Somebody handed me a knife once. I was out on the range cutting into those thick green military, pop-up kind of targets. And somebody handed me a knife, and I didn't think anything of it. And I tried to shove it through this thick plastic target. And I just assumed it was a folding knife, and it was not. And it folded on my fingers, and I got stitches, and I learned a lesson. In today's modern world, unless it was something handed down to you and it's special to you, there's no reason to not get a good, solid locking knife from a good, solid, reputable manufacturer. Buck, Gerber, any of those good name brands, Spyderco. There's so many good brands. cold steel. Any of those name brand locking mechanisms are going to be solid. They're going to be much better, I think, and much safer than a folding knife that doesn't lock. Just go into Walmart and get one of those, $20, $30, folding Gerbers. If you want to start there, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure it's slim, make sure it's light, or you're probably going to leave it at home. And try and make sure it's big enough to be useful. Another good mention, a buddy of mine that I respect a lot and is maybe a bigger knife guy than me. He really likes the CRKT M16 style. They make a bunch of different variants of the M16 knife is what I'm talking about. They make, a bunch of different blade styles, serrated, not serrated, different sizes. But that's a good, slim, solid EDC knife. A lot of military law enforcement guys have been carrying that knife for a long time. It's been around. Also, what I have carried before, I kind of transitioned away from it for the buck. But the Cold Steel Tough Light, it's tough, it's light. It comes in a couple of different blade styles, I believe, a couple of different colors. It's a good, solid locking knife that's big enough to be useful. It's a little bit shorter than the buck knife, a little bit smaller blade, but pretty robust if you want to check that out. K-Bar makes one that's very similar. I don't have any experience with it, but it's very similar, it looks like, to the Buck 110 Slim, and that's going to be the Dozer. Looks like a good solid knife. And I'm sure there are many, many more that I'm leaving out that I'm not mentioning. But just a good, solid folding knife. Like I said, you're a grown man, you can make your own choices on that. But get one, carry one, see if it doesn't come in useful, see if it doesn't come in handy if you haven't been carrying one thus far. The knife gives you the ability to do stuff that you wouldn't be able to do without it. And as an alpha male, why wouldn't you want to be able to do more and achieve more? And the knife is just a small, easy way to do that. The second thing, if you don't want to carry a pocket knife, you may look at a neck knife. No, I don't carry a neck knife. I never really have carried a neck knife. But there's nothing wrong with it. There's a lot to be said for it. It's easier and quicker to access with both hands. It may be more concealable. Generally, if you're carrying a knife in your pocket, you got the pocket clip. But there may be some environments where you don't want people to know at all that you have a knife. Now, most people aren't going to notice that you have a clip in your pocket or even care what it is or notice what it is. But there may be times where a neck knife is better. Main reasons I don't carry one is, one, I'm just used to one. I like the pocket knife, to be honest. Number two is a lot of times I tuck my shirt in, which kind of defeats the purpose of quickly getting to a neck knife. But the neck knife is good and is generally going to be a fixed blade knife. A small fixed blade knife is a good EDC knife as well. My wife's running knife that she goes running with is a Cold Steel push dagger, which is a great thing for her to run with. It's great for her to have on her. She's not wearing a belt, she's not wearing something with pockets. That gives her the ability to defend herself far better than she would be if she was unarmed. If you want a specific model, the Cold Steel Urban Pal, I've carried the Cold Steel push daggers for quite a while. I really like them. As I said, my EDC knife is a Buck 110 Slim, but when I'm at work, when I have my war belt on, in that war belt is a Cold Steel push dagger, a little bit bigger version than that. But I really like the push dagger. I have a little bit of fighting experience, MMA experience, wrestling experience, and that push dagger is just something that is easy to use with gross motor skills when your adrenaline's going. If you know how to throw a punch, if you know how to do stuff like that, it's a great thing. It's like I said, it's a better defensive tool, quicker to access, a good fixed blade push dagger, but it's not as multi-purpose as your everyday carry knife. You're probably not. Certainly not as multi-purpose as like your Buck 110 Slim or your folding knife in your pocket. But it's a good EDC option. If you want a neck knife, which is going to give you a little bit more utility, or a neck push dagger, or even a belt push dagger, something like that, if you want to carry it on your belt, that's a better defensive option, but a little bit less well-rounded. And make sure they're illegal in a lot of areas. If you live in one of those states that tries to limit your defensive freedom, then you may want to make sure that that's legal in your area. Now, on the fixed blade, since we talked about a fixed blade and folding blade, some people will say that fixed blades are not good for, defense. I would beg to differ. As long as it's a good solid knife from a good solid manufacturer, I wouldn't want to get some Chinese-made knife, from a bargain bin that costs $5. But any good solid knife brand from a good solid manufacturer with a good solid locking mechanism, for an EDC knife, I think that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. All things being equal, size and weight, blade length is what I'd rather have for a defensive tool, a fixed blade, than a folding blade. Yeah, probably. It's less moving parts, less things to go wrong. I don't have to worry about unfolding it to get it into action if I need to quickly. But, like I said, it's not my primary defensive tool. And the primary reason I have it is generally not even for defense. And the folding knife lets you get, a knife that literally almost cuts in half the size of its footprint. If you ask me if I was going to get into, a life or death fight, number one, I'd try to avoid it, if at all possible. And if it wasn't going to cost somebody else their life. Number two, I'd want a gun, a firearm, probably a shotgun or a rifle depending on the distance. If not, then a handgun. And then if it had to be a knife, I would probably prefer a fixed blade, a big fixed blade combat knife. They're called combat knives for a reason. But again, I'm probably not carrying that every day. I'd much rather have a good solid locking folding knife on me. That's way better than a big solid, fixed blade knife that I don't carry on me. If you want to carry a fixed blade on you, I'm not discouraging that at all. I think that's great. Now, if you're talking about the primary, let's say you don't, for whatever reason, you're not old enough to carry a handgun yet. You live in a state where you just can't carry a handgun. There's lots of reasons. Perhaps when you were younger, you made a stupid mistake. You're a convicted felon, but you've repented. You still want a way to defend yourself. Maybe you're going to a certain area where you can't carry a gun, but you can still have a knife. Now, of all the folding knives that I've ever carried, and I carried one for years, remember I always said Gerber makes some, budget-friendly knives and some really high-end knives. A knife that I really like, especially if it's going to be a folding knife for defense, my number one recommendation is going to be the Gerber 06 Auto. They make a couple of different versions of it. They make a Tonto. They make a more traditional blade. They make a just regular straight edge and a partially serrated knife. Any of those are awesome choices. The Gerber 06 Auto. They're going to run you, if you can get one, just a little under $200. But they got that good premium steel, that S30V. They are a tank of a knife. I would have no hesitation in worrying about that thing, the locking mechanism not working on it. The Gerber 06 Autos, if that was my primary defensive knife and I wanted a folder, that would be it. Like I said, I carry, obviously, a firearm, and I'm the leader of a tactical team, but, my backup to that is a push dagger. I like the push dagger for me, for my training, for my experience. I think the push dagger, for a defensive tool, is going to be better than a folding knife. It's got a lot of advantages. It's very, very hard to take away from somebody. It'd be very hard for somebody to take away from me. If you know how to throw a punch, a push dagger makes a punch far, far more effective in those kind of encounters. So if it's for a fixed blade and the primary purpose is defense, that'd be my go-to. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, some people might not know, but, during the war, I was issued, either a bayonet or a K-bar. I carried both. The K-bar is kind of the quintessential combat fighting knife, but it's a big, heavy knife. Even as a Marine in combat, a lot of times I wouldn't carry that K-bar. I would just carry a 4-inch Gerber fixed blade knife. You're probably not walking around with a full-size, fixed blade combat knife. May you want to have one of those somewhere? Do they come in useful? Yes, they're great knives. Some kind of big, robust combat knife. They have their uses. If you're looking for one on a budget, that's a great knife. Glock, if you don't know, Glock made knives, I believe, before they started making guns. Glock makes a field knife. It is a military, Austrian-issued, military knife. It comes in at like under $30. It's got good steel. It's strong. So the Glock field knife, if you're looking for like a full-size, combat knife on a budget. But like I said, for most people, most of the time, for most men, that's not really a realistic option. I'm not going to talk about karambits. I have like zero training in karambits. I don't know that fighting style. I've never trained in it. I'm not going to pretend to know things that I don't know. If you're going the fixed blade route, a good medium-sized fixed blade knife, I say medium, 3 to 4 inch blade, 2.5 to 3 inch to 4 inch blade, somewhere in that range. My favorite and good, not too big to be a hindrance, but big enough to be useful. The Tops knives, Iraq Jack, just like it sounds, Iraq Jack. It's a great knife. If you're looking for a fixed blade that you could carry all the time, that one kind of stays on my day bag. It's not my EDC knife, unless you count my EDC bag, but it's like not on my person all the time. But it's a great knife. If you're looking for a good fixed blade recommendation, the Tops knives, Iraq Jack is a good one. Like I said, not ridiculously big and big enough to be useful. One time my wife and I were on a road trip coming back from one of the western states, and the lady in front of us hit a deer. Well, the deer was still alive, so I got out and I took care of it. And not wanting all that meat to go to waste, I grabbed my, Tops knives, Iraq Jack from the little sling bag they usually carry, usually rides beside. And so I hopped out with the wife, and we took care of that deer, and that knife was big enough to be useful. I was never like, oh, this is all I got. Now, if I'm professionally hunting or I'm going out to hunt, do I want like a complete kit? a smaller knife, a bigger knife, a saw, a hatchet. Yeah, I'd like all that stuff. But that knife did just fine. Big enough to be useful. I certainly consider it big enough for defense or anything in that vein. I've never used one, but I've seen them, and a good runner-up for that, good fixed blade knife that's probably not too big to carry. The K-bar, it's called the wrench knife. It looks like if you took like an old Craftsman wrench and like forged it into a knife. You might want to look at that one if you want to save some money. The Tops knives aren't the cheapest. I'm sure that's a good solid knife. The next thing we'll talk about is multi-tools. Now, I usually have a multi-tool somewhere nearby, but I don't generally carry a multi-tool on me all the time. Now, when I was a professional hunter and guide, a big part of that job was being a ranch manager. I managed an exotic game ranch, and a lot of that was literally, riding fences, mending fences, repairing things. And for stuff like that, a multi-tool really comes in handy. And maybe that's more in your line of work. Maybe you decide, for EDC you want to start carrying a multi-tool. Maybe you're a mechanic. Maybe you just like to tinker and fix things. And that's great. That's a great manly quality to create and fix and repair. Maybe a multi-tool is more your style. Now you can go the traditional like Leatherman multi-tool route. And I think there's two kinds of those. There's the little mini multi-tools, which are great for EDC. Something like, I think the Gerber Dime is what it's called. Super tiny. Leatherman also makes one. It's really, really small. I've had those in the past. They're great. Cabela's or Bass Pro Shop makes one that's like $6, and it's a good tiny little, micro kind of multi-tool. Pair of pliers, a saw, a knife, your screwdrivers. And those are great. And if you want to carry one, a bigger full-size multi-tool like your traditional Leatherman and traditional Gerbers. Now, I'm going to be honest, I actually like the Gerber versions a little bit better than the Leathermans. But if you get one, especially if it's a full-size one, like we talked about earlier, get a locking blade if you can. Get the tools and the blades that actually lock in place. Both Gerber and Leatherman make ones with locking blades. And if you're going to get a full-size one, I see no reason to not get one with a locking blade. But multi-tools, great. Obviously, they do more things than just a knife can do. But they're generally not as good a knife. Your other route for that is going to be your Swiss Army style knives, your Victorinox or whatever other brands. Your knife with a bunch of different blades or a bunch of different attachments. Now, those are great too. In fact, I think it's probably a good idea to have one of those little ones in your pocket if you want. But it shouldn't take the place. I would not really consider that a defensive tool. Number one, it doesn't lock. If you really had to, it's better than your bare fist. But that you kind of lose the defensive ability in those. Not only do they not lock, but most of them don't have a pocket clip. So if you have to get to it fast, you don't really know how it's oriented or, where it's at in your pocket. It's going to be hard to get to in a fight and a struggle, I think. Harder than, something else like a folding or a fixed blade, more traditional pocket knife. But it does give you some different, functionality. So if that's what you want to carry, that's fine. If you decide you're never going to use a knife for defense, those are fine. Now, a good thing that I carried for years, and then I left it somewhere, but it's a great knife designed by G&G Hawk. That's a great company out of Idaho. G&G Hawk Designs makes a lot of really great knives, but this one is not even one of their better made knives, but it's one that I guess Kershaw produces, and I don't know the name of it, but I'm sure you can find it. It's a Kershaw G&G Hawk knife. And it's like your traditional, folding pocket knife, and it's got a, 3-inch or somewhere in there blade. It's good enough to be a good defensive knife, a good cutting tool. I wouldn't be upset if I had to, slice open a deer with it. It's a good, usable defensive knife, utility knife. Got a good multifunctional purpose blade, but it also in the back of it has a little thing that folds out and lets you use like the 1/4-inch driver bits, and it even comes with a couple of different bits that fold into and out of the handle without giving it a lot of extra bulk. And that was the best of all that I've seen. Multi-use, multi-tool, and good quick access, good size, good enough to be useful knife. If you're looking for something like that, a good compromise and a good utilitarian defensive knife and a multi-tool would be that Kershaw G&G Hawk knife. Is a great knife and a great little multi-tool. Especially if you're going to be out at the range, out shooting, out something like that, and you want something with different bits to be able to be useful. Or like I said, you're the person that likes to fix stuff or you're constantly tinkering on something. That is a great design. Alright guys, we're at half an hour in and we've only really talked about a few different knives. We haven't really talked about, blade types, blade shapes. There's so much that could go into it. I don't think I'm going to get into that today. But I will talk about different steel types real quick. In my younger days, I always thought, you go to Walmart, you need a pocket knife, you get a $20 folding knife, that locks, and that's fine. And, it was fine. I I went to war with those knives. They stayed in my pocket. They opened many a thing that I needed opened. And I, talking about that Gerber 06 Auto, that was the first real premium knife I think that I ever had. And I was looking like $200 for a knife. Well, I got a really good deal at one. I forget if it was like a pawn shop or eBay. And what really sold me on it is I saw a guy in a store, and he dropped one and went to catch it. And I saw the way that it sliced open his hand. And I mean, it was a wicked bad cut on his hand. And of course, like any logical, alpha male is like, oh, that really messed up his hand. I want one of those. But I didn't want to spend $200 on one. So I got one used. And even used, even though it had been very well used, you could tell, like, this thing had been ridden hard and put away wet. I sharpened that thing, and just that premium steel, which this one is S30V, just how sharp it got and how sharp it stayed, I could see, the reason for a high-end good steel knife. If you want something, a little bit nicer, I really like S30V. 154 cm is also a good steel. Looking for something somewhere in the middle that's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, but it's a good steel. Look for a good, D2 tool steel. That's a great steel also. Carbon fiber is, not carbon fiber, but rather high carbon steel is a really good sharp steel. Assuming it's got a good heat treat from what I understand, but like 1095 is not a super expensive steel. It's a great steel for cutting, a great steel for putting an edge on and holding an edge. The issue is that it's not super, corrosion resistant. So, if you're a pirate, probably not the knife for you. A lot of places like Tops, they use that steel even though they're a high-end knife, but they just coat it with something so you don't have to worry about the blade rusting. And generally a stainless steel, obviously, is going to be a more corrosion resistance. But unless you go with the higher end, like super steels, they're not going to hold an edge as well as like a high carbon steel or one of the other D2 steels. But anyway, guys, I encourage you, if you're that alpha male, really give some thought to carrying a knife every day. A knife, I don't care if you carry the ones that I recommend or carry something else. Maybe you know something better that I've never even tried yet. That's great. Have that knife, have it on you. Be able to offer it to others if they need a knife. Be the man that has the thing, not the man that's in need of something. Be the man that can provide for others. Be the man that can protect himself. Make yourself more capable and more able to defend, to provide, to do. Alright guys, hopefully this is a good, useful, and kind of fun episode talking about knives. Kind of a nice, enjoyable episode. We're a group of community of men. What community of men doesn't like getting together and talking about knives? We've talked about knives in the past. We did one, the Manly Skills episode. You may go back and give that one a listen if you want. Also, if you like this podcast, you may like a few others. You may like, if you care about the more important stuff, Simple Man Sermons. The preachings of a simple man called by God to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And if guns are your thing, your gunfighter life. If you did like this podcast and you want to support the community that you're now a part of, please like, subscribe, and comment on whatever platform you're listening to this on. It really does help. You can find this podcast and the other ones under the umbrella of Good Shepherd Training. Hello, men. Although it's seamless for you, it's been about a week for me since I recorded this podcast. I recorded in advance and it was going to come out a little bit later this morning. But I thought I'd add a few different things into this podcast. You see, part of being an alpha male, I believe, it should be circumspection, questioning oneself and one's practices, testing, reasoning, and trying to improve. One small token of that, after doing this podcast on knives this week, I started experimenting with carrying a fixed blade. Fixed blade I've been trying to carry is a Tops Knives Tracker number 4. And we'll see how that goes. I may go back to carrying just a buck 110 as my EDC knife. Maybe I'll decide carrying a fixed blade is better. Definitely has some advantages and disadvantages that I'm discovering. But anyway, that's just a small token. A bigger token of that, in the course of this week, praying and reading the Bible and reasoning and thinking about the podcast, using the talents I've been given to bear more fruit. I was going back and checking out older episodes of the Alpha Male podcast. One I thought that would pair nicely with this one was an EDC episode. Was recorded in July of 2018, so about 3 years ago. Now, I don't have to tell anybody listening, I bet, that the world's changed quite a bit in 3 years. And my EDC has evolved a little bit in 3 years, although it's still a good podcast and a lot of it still applies. So this week, we're going to see if it bears fruit. I'm going to put out one new podcast, and I'm going to put out one of the recasts of an older episode. So I'm going to put out this one on knives and the one on EDC. Now, if you've already heard it, you don't want to listen to it, that's fine. But I'm going to try this and see if it bears more fruit. That way you guys get a little double dose of manly this week on the Alpha Male podcast. So we'll see how it goes. Now, like I said, there are some changes, so I'm going to put those changes on Patreon. They're going to be free to go look at for everybody on Patreon. There's some content that everybody can see on Patreon, and there's some insider content on Patreon. This podcast is free to everybody to listen, and I like it that way, but it is not free to put out and free to produce. So this community that you're now a part of, if you feel called to, not out of guilt because you want to support the community you're now a part of and be a productive member of it, like we said, you don't have to financially support. You can like, subscribe, comment, share it with your friends. But if you feel called to financially support to help the podcast and help this community, you can sign up on Patreon for as little as $1 a month and help support the podcast. But you can go there and see a few of the notes. I went back and re-listened to that podcast on EDC. I'll put some of the changes that have occurred in the EDC over the past 3 years. Like I said, that'll be free for everybody. And if you want some more insider content, you can go check that out. Just go to Patreon and type in Good Shepherd Training, or you can just go there if you forget that and type in Alpha Male Podcast. And we'll see if it bears fruit. Another thing I'd like to try to improve the podcast. Maybe this will become a regular thing. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, as a man, always be testing, always be trying to improve, whether it's at the gym, whether it's, in your shooting skills, whether it's whatever that is that applies in your life. Trying to improve your marriage, all manner of aspects, your Bible reading. Always be seeking to be better. To he who has more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. So I want to put out a tactical tip in this episode. That's what we'll call it, a tac tip. A little thank you for listening to the end. And this tac tip I learned as a police officer, and that's going to be, try and make it a habit when you're driving around to keep your window cracked so you can hear what's going on outside. For situational awareness, whether it be in an urban environment, if you hear, somebody screaming for help, you might not hear them with the windows rolled all the way up. Or likewise, in a more rural environment, you may hear the bleats of a deer in a ditch, and we don't want anything to suffer. You may hear the sound of a far-off car accident in either one of those environments. It may alert you a couple seconds early of a carjacking. Or if you're on your phone like we all do, even though we know we shouldn't when we're driving, our heads down for a second, that noise may alert us of a crash ahead, so we look up. And by God's grace, they're delivered out of that. So just a little tip I learned from being a police officer. Obviously, if it's pouring down rain or something like that, you may not be able to. But keeping those windows cracked, especially your driver's side window, just to improve that situational awareness. A good tip, a good man tip. Thanks for listening, guys. And really, I'm humbled. Thanks for being a part of this community. This is our podcast. Let's keep it going strong. In Jesus' name, amen.